Hello. This is new for me. I've never done this before. I don't know why I want to do this, but we're doing it. And maybe this will never see the light of day. But if you're watching this, then I guess it has. We have a lot to talk about. We have 106 books to talk about. I read a bunch of books in the year 2024. I thought it would be fun to challenge myself to read over 100 books. I did so. It's been good, and this is an excuse for me to talk about all of those books. More for me than for you, but if you watch this and you enjoy it, then I guess it's for you too. Why don't we just get into this? First thing I read this year, and I will say, before we go, I'm probably going to start off a little shaky. First books are probably going to be a little slow, a little garbled in the mouth, and as I get to book 106, I think I'll have a lot more to say. I did not review anything before sitting down for this, so the books that I read in January are going to be a little bit fuzzier in my head than the ones I just read in December. So bear that in mind. If you hear any noises in the background, there are furry friends walking around. Maybe they'll come on camera at some point. Maybe you'll meet them. That being said, let's get started after these messages. Thank you for sitting through that ad break. I appreciate you. So, first book I read this year, Ivan Turgenev's Fathers and Sons. I really hope you can see these covers. I'm going to try and hold them to the screen for each one as I go. This is my first Turgenev. I am 3/4 Russian myself. There are way too many Russians I have not read. It's a little bit embarrassing. This was super duper good. I'm a big fan of Oxford World Classics editions. I think they're just beautiful books. I'll keep things as spoiler free in this entire spiel as I can. Basically, political unrest, young people trying to fight for causes they believe in. I think the narration was just beautiful. I think the voices were just beautiful. Are you already meeting a furry friend? You are already meeting a furry friend. That did not take long. This is a furry friend. She hates being picked up, but you get to meet her today. This is Eerie. She's a cutie pie, and that's all she has to say. Do you have anything you want to say? No. You hate me. All right. Anyway, Fathers and Sons. The title, I want to say there's another title in Russian that this doesn't always translate to. One of my favorite lines in this, I'm gonna find it really quick. To take action, to smash things, he went on. But how can you smash something without even knowing why you're doing it? We smash things because we're a force, remarked Arkady. Beautiful. I really enjoy the narration in this book, the irony of the ending, the way the characters interact with each other, super duper cool. Second was The Butterfly Lampshade, Amy Bender. This is the only hardcover book you're going to see out of all 106. I'm not a hardcover fan. I really like softcover books, so don't expect too many from me. I bought this purely because it's just so beautiful. Look at it. And it's got a purple binding, like, oh my goodness. I found this book absolutely beautiful. The contents of the book I found a little less beautiful. I was not blown away. Sometimes I judge a book by its cover, and I'm pretty good at knowing when I'm gonna like something based on its cover. I was very wrong this time. I was not a big fan of this book. I like the back and forth on how this main character deals with their mental health concerns. Other than that, I don't think the writing was very strong, and I wasn't very engaged in the story. Unfortunate. I probably won't be picking her up again, though. Susan Sontag's Death Kit. I have actually not read Susan Sontag before. I know she has so much cool stuff, and not a whole lot of fiction. This is fiction from her. And I thought the cover was really pretty. That's probably going to be a running trend in a lot of this, is I think the book is beautiful, so I read it. That, or I knew the person and I just went for it. I enjoyed this. It is long. It's not actually that long. It's about 300 pages, but it feels long. And it's about a character, Diddy, who does a horrible thing and spends the next 300 pages kind of going out of his mind over this thing. But you really explore how he goes out of his mind and why he goes out of his mind and all these really minute little things. And I really like the writing in this book. I will say, I need to read more Sontag. This was pretty cool. Barbara Kingsolver's Pigs in Heaven was next. You're gonna see a lot of her on this list. I really like Barbara Kingsolver. Several books of hers I read for the first time this year, and then one or two were rereads. This was a first time read. This is a sequel to her first book called The Bean Trees. If you've never read her, she is a really down-to-earth writer. She writes a lot about family, she writes a lot about interactions with nature and the earth and how we live our lives in relation to each other and the planet. I enjoyed this one. I think I liked The Bean Trees, the prequel, more, but there are a lot of really good characters in this one, and I enjoy the back and forth narration as it kind of jumps across different states in the US to tell us the story. Not my favorite of hers. A couple others on this list from her I like a little bit more, but I did still enjoy this one. I would recommend any of her books. I just love her. The Beans of Egypt, Maine by Carolyn Shute. Let's just take a moment to enjoy this cover. I think it's beautiful. This is an interesting one. I was living in the state of Maine earlier in this year when I read this, so I was kind of enthralled. I don't know if people there really read this book, but I wanted to go for it. It's a really, really interesting narration style. This is about a couple different families living in the state of Maine, fairly impoverished, and their relationships with each other. There's a family called the Beans. Those Beans are some wacky people, but ironically not really any more wacky than the other people in the story. And this kind of chronicles how those different families and the Beans interact with each other, intermarry, and how their lives play out in mostly depressing ways. It's good. I liked it. She has a sequel to this. She has a couple sequels. One of them I've got on the shelf. It's a big book. I think it's like 600 pages. I've yet to pick it up. I believe it's called Merry Men. This was worth the read. You gotta be really prepared for this style of writing. It's jaunty, it's all over the place, it's extreme. She writes in capitals as characters yell at each other. It can be a lot, but I think it's worth the read if you're looking for this style of narration. This is The Waters of Thirst by Adam Mars Jones. This was, I didn't know what I was getting into. I mostly read books blind. If I know the writer, I pick it up. If I like a cover, I pick it up. If I'm interested in the publisher, I pick it up. If it's a classic, I pick it up. I didn't know what I was getting into with this one. This is a unique experience, I'll give it that. This is about a narrator with kidney troubles. He is on dialysis several days a week. It's basically like a 200-page narration of him kind of talking about his life and how water and thirst and a lot of other factors kind of play into his daily existence. He can only drink certain amounts of water every day because his kidneys don't work properly. It's a really... I know the word interesting is going to keep coming up here because I'm trying to be nice to books that I maybe didn't like as much. I didn't hate this book. I think I enjoyed it for most of its run, and the small, silly mysteries it kind of weaves out through this person's conscious and subconscious. The ending is insane. I think on the ending alone, I'm not sure that I'd really recommend this, but the narration style's kind of cool, and it's a big cup of water, so take that for what you will. Then we had The Remains of the Day. So this was my second Kazuo Ishiguro. My first was The Unconsoled. I read that on loan from a friend. I really liked The Unconsoled. From what I understand, and we'll see a couple other Ishiguros on this list, The Unconsoled is his least conventional book from all of his works, and I wanted to try others because I enjoyed The Unconsoled. I liked how dreamlike it was, I liked how sprawling and seemingly endless it felt while so little was happening simultaneously, plus I like the piano and I was interested in that. This is super well known, so I wanted to give it a try. It's about a butler recounting his days serving a rich guy in a manor, and he's traveling the countryside to meet up with an old employee who he worked with, and he's sort of just recounting these stories of his time working there. I didn't hate it. I like the narration style, and there's a common trend that's going to come up. I think there are two more Ishiguros on this list that we're going to talk about. This is probably my favorite of the three that I read this year. I like the contemplative style, which is super common for his books, I'm finding now that I've read 4 of them. I like the style. I like the contemplative narrators. I like the idea of looking back and memory and thinking about things through a different lens and reshaping our perspective on things that we've spent years and decades thinking we knew already and realizing maybe we don't know them the way we thought we knew them, and it's hard to grapple with those things and come to terms with things that you maybe have pushed away and repressed in your memory, and I'm interested in that. I think he does that more successfully in some books than in others. Out of the 4 that I've read, this is a successful example. I can see why this is so well known. I liked this quite a bit. So this is a reread for me. This is Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. I've read this more times than I can count. It's one of my... It's a favorite reread. It's so short, you can read it in an afternoon. It's a beautiful, beautiful story. Hi! Hello! If you haven't read it or heard of Hermann Hesse, he's a super duper famous German writer from the early to mid 20th century. This is The Story of Buddha, if you've never heard of it. It's about Siddhartha basically becoming an enlightened Buddha. I might be getting that slightly wrong. My religious studies are not super great. This is just a beautiful story. The writing is gorgeous. More Hermann Hesse is going to come up on this list. I'm going to save more thoughts for later, but I cannot recommend this book enough. It's gorgeous. Excuse me. I have things to talk about, and you're rubbing up on all the books. You know that. You're really cute. Next, we read The Inheritors by William Golding. So everybody's going to know William Golding if you live in America. He is the writer of Lord of the Flies. Every kid in America probably read this. I don't dislike Lord of the Flies. I thought it was neat. I wanted to give him another try. Kind of wish I didn't read it. I rarely say that, but maybe I'll give this a reread someday. And this is probably one of my least favorite things I read this year. This is about a group of proto-humans who are doing their thing, living on Earth a long time ago, and they encounter another group of proto-humans and things ensue. Let's just say that. I think it's a little too vague at times. I think it's too sparse almost all of the time. And, oh man, I like the message he's getting at here, but I was just not a fan. I'm sorry, William, it's just not for me. Next up was Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This is beautiful. This is my first Huxley, right? Yeah, my first Huxley. I've got a couple others on the shelf, but I've yet to try them out. It's dystopia at its finest. I'm gonna keep this super duper sparse. Cannot recommend this enough. This is fantastic. I'm just gonna pick out a favorite line I like here. Of course it does. Actual happiness always looks pretty squalid in comparison with the overcompensations for misery. And of course, stability isn't nearly so spectacular as instability. Being contented has none of the glamour of a good fight against misfortune, none of the picturesqueness of a struggle with temptation, or a fatal overthrow by passion or doubt. Happiness is never grand. Next up was Willa Cather's The Troll Garden. Now this was my first Cather, and also I believe her first book. I read a couple others of hers later in this year, so we'll get into them. I love this. I love her. I knew I was gonna love her. I'm a huge George Eliot fan, and I just knew I was gonna like Willa Cather. I'd been meaning to read her for a long time, so I'm super glad I got into her. This is a collection of short stories, all more or less about people in creative spheres doing different things. Some are hosting a party, some are painting at home, some are struggling with paintings, some are paintings from posthumous works. Like, these stories are great. I really liked this as a foray into Willa Cather's work. I know this is not going to be anywhere near her most popular, but this was great. This is a great little collection. Highly recommend this, and I highly recommend the others that we will get to from her later on. Next up, we have Kobo Abe's The Ruined Map. Now, I have read a couple of his books before. I've read another one later this year as well. This is a Japanese writer, Kobo Abe. He writes some really, they're not dystopic, but he writes some really dark and grimy and wild stories where your characters are very often plunged into mental spaces that they were not prepared for, have to traverse worlds that feel labyrinthian, feel almost absurdly large and out to get them and out to push them into places that they can't understand. This is kind of all those things in one. This is about a detective who is given very little information and is told to find a missing person, and I enjoyed this. This is, I think, the longest of the 4 of his books that I've read. It's about 300 pages. Probably could have been cut down a little bit. The journey starts to, build upon itself quite a lot. It stagnates at points, I think. But there is a certain rhythm to his writing. His best known book is The Woman in the Dunes. That is a beautiful, beautiful book. And I think that's the best foray into his writing. But this is an interesting journey. I think these vintage international editions are really, really beautiful, as are the old ones of his. But just know he can be a bit much to get into. The writing is not technically complex, but it is dense in a kind of surprising way that I think you don't realize or pick up on at first. Next up was this beauty called Beyond Addiction. This is essentially a book to help people who have people with addictions in their lives. I have folks with addictions in my life. I wanted to read this and kind of take notes and learn how to help those people in my life better and be a better person in a system of support. So this was great. I found it on a library shelf. I read a bunch of it, ended up getting a copy for myself so I could notate and annotate and come back to this as a resource at home. This is really, really good. If you have people with addiction issues in your life, I would say this is worth it. Next, we have Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid. I have read a couple of her books before, and I think there's another one on this list. She is a writer from Antigua. She writes a lot of stories about young women trying to find their place in the world, trying to break out of molds that were set for them. This is one of her first books. I think it's her second after her essay A Small Place. I don't always connect with her work, but I think if you're looking for a narrative like that, she's a really good pick. Next we have Camus' The Fall, and can we just appreciate this cover, because oh man, I love this edition of the book. Old vintage, chef's kiss. This is, oh, hi. Where'd you come from? This is my first Camus, and what a way to begin. There's more of him later on this list. This is, wow. I mean, wow. I think a lot of people will be familiar with Camus. I was not. I picked this up because I've always wanted to try reading him. This is told from a first-person perspective of a man speaking to another man, confessing to something. That's all I'm gonna say. I need to read more Camus. This is stunning. Next up we have Masuji Ibuse's Black Rain. This is a book he wrote learning of actual accounts of folks who survived the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II. This is harrowing. The writing is amazing. The writing is tough to read, but there's a really interesting undertone in this. He's writing about families, he's writing about individuals, he's writing about personal stories of people who survived these atrocities. And I think his handling of the subject matter and the handling of these personal stories is just so good. It's really, really special. Like, he really focuses in on those tiny glimmers of hope that these people cling onto that feel so commonplace but so beautiful and deep down at the soul at the same time. This is a good one. I know he's got a couple other books I'd be interested in reading. This is really, really a special book. Next we have The Golden Gate by Vikram Seth. This is a book told in verse, as you can see. He's got some rhyming couplets in there. This was a fun read. It's a modern day sort of epic poem or prose poem told, not a prose poem, what am I talking about? I don't know what I'm talking about. This is a modern day poem told through chapter and verse about some folks living in San Francisco. Is the Golden Gate Bridge, right? I think that's right. Golden Gate Bridge. They're living in San Francisco. Personal relationships, romantic relationships. It's a fun read. I think reading something of this style written more contemporarily is cool. It's not something that you see very often. Dark night and silent, calm and lovely, that stills the efforts of our lives. Rare, excellent, kind, and behovely, no matter how the poet strives to weave with epithets and clauses your soundless web, he falters, pauses, and your enchantment slips between his hands as if it's never been. Of all time most imbued with beauty, you lend us by your spell relief from ineradicable grief. If for a spell and pain and duty, we sleep and nightly are made whole in our fretted mind and soul. Now here we have Jhumpa Lahiri's Whereabouts. This was a gift. If you know her, you probably know Interpreter of Melodies. Fantastic book of short stories. Her debut collection, highly recommend that one. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for Whereabouts. This is not good. This is kind of turning me off from wanting to read any more from her. This is a collection of little vignettes. Every chapter is a location, right? In spring, in the waiting room, in the bookstore, in my head, on the balcony, at the cash register. Some are existential, some are physical. There's not much to work with here, I'm gonna be perfectly honest with you. I was not a big fan of this. I think the writing is pretty weak, and I don't know that I'm gonna really try anything from her again. I'd sooner reread Interpreter of Melodies than I would try a third from Jhumpa Lahiri, which is unfortunate to say because Interpreter of Melodies is so good. Next up, we have The Shell Collector by, what is your name? Anthony Doerr. He is well known for All the Light We Cannot See. I believe that's the name of the book. It's on the shelf, haven't read it. This is his first book, a collection of short stories. Hit and miss for me. I don't think I'm really a fan of his style of writing. There's a couple good ones in here. I would say the titular, The Shell Collector, is a solid story. The Hunter's Wife, easily best in the collection, and Mikondo at the end is pretty good. If you're looking to pick this up, you could kind of skip the other ones. I don't think they're very memorable. I can't even really recall what happens in most of them. I don't know that I'm really ever going to pick up more from him. He's just not my cup of tea, I don't think. But look at how cute he is. Look at how cute he is. He's adorable. I'll give him that. And a couple decent stories in here, so not bad. I just don't think they're really for me. And here we are with Faust. That is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and I'm sorry for my pronunciation. I'm sure I'm gonna botch a couple other things in this video. This is the kind of book where as soon as I put it down, I feel like I need to pick it up again and just reread it because there's so much going on here. Anyone who doesn't know what this is or hasn't heard of Goethe or hasn't heard of Faust, it is a German legend told through a couple different people's narratives, but Goethe's version is just this massive, sprawling, poetic drama about the devil who kind of comes down to meet with this guy Faust. They go on some wacky adventures together. It's incredible. It is nothing short of incredible. I know this took most of Goethe's life to write, and holy heck, yeah, it's worth it. This is just beautiful. Next up, we are doing a double because I read two back-to-back. So these are In Evil Hour and The Autumn of the Patriarch, both by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I had read one of his books before, Love in the Time of Cholera. That's a beautiful book. I have not read his most famous 100 Years of Solitude? Is that what it's called? I wanted to say Labyrinth of Solitude, but that's Octavio Paz. Let's start with Evil Hour. This is an early book for him. I really like these editions, by the way. In Evil Hour, a little weaker. I think the narrative doesn't deliver as hard as it could, but this is about a small town in, pretty sure it was in Mexico, where the citizens are kind of oddly turning against each other as an unknown or several unknown persons are kind of flagging the town with dirty secrets about different people. It's pretty fun, it's pretty engaging. I don't think it delivers as hard as it could, but it's not a bad read by any means for Garcia Marquez, but there are certainly stronger. This is The Autumn of the Patriarch. This is a read. Whew. If you are at all curious what this is like like this, where every single page is slogs and slogs of text over and over and over again. The book is about this guy, the Patriarch. He has been alive for who knows how long. A ridiculously, absurdly, monstrously, disgustingly, despicably long time. This guy needs to die because people are sick of him. People have been sick of him for hundreds of years. We don't even know how he lives that long, but somehow he does. He's been in charge for way too long. The city crumbles around him, yet he doesn't care. He does whatever the hell he wants. His libido is insatiable. It's a wild book. It can be a slog at times, just going through walls of text. There are chapters, but every chapter is an endless wall. It's a tough read, but it's a worthwhile read. The prose is just immaculate. It always is. Not a first read if you've never read Garcia Marquez before. I can certainly recommend Love in the Time of Cholera, probably 100 Years of Solitude since it's so beloved. Wouldn't say this to do it as a first read, but as a second or a third or a fourth, worth it. Next up, we have Searching for El Dorado by, I don't remember your name, Mark Herman. I had a copy of this book on the shelf for years. I thought it was just finally time to pick it up and do a little bit of a low-stakes read. This is about traveling the gold rush in the rainforest of Guyana. He is sort of a traveling reporter who goes there with an excuse of learning. There are bits and pieces of this that are enjoyable. I think the narrative can be fun to follow at times. I think the facts of the matter are the most important part of this book, right? Like the facts of mining gold and digging gold and finding gold in this region of the Amazon rainforest in Guyana is the appeal. I don't think he delivers all that well. Not gonna recommend this very highly. I would probably just read some actual nonfiction about this so that I can learn a little more and take the narrative out of it, because I don't think Mark Herman's writing is very strong. Next up, we have Tripmaster Monkey by Maxine Hong Kingston. Oh my god, my back is burning. This was not a good idea. She is well known for writing The Woman Warrior, which I read several years ago, but I'm meaning to pick up again. This is about Whitman Singh. He's a Chinese-American self-ascribed playwright. He doesn't really produce much. He's abrasive, he's kind of rude, he doesn't have a whole lot of close friends, but the friends he does have and the relationships he has are important to him. It culminates in a really interesting way. I think the narrative is a little too long for me. I got a little bored with this book, I'll be honest, but not a terrible read. Hong Kingston's writing is special. I think she's a really, really great writer. Wouldn't say I don't recommend this, just not a huge recommendation. If you're into books set in Northern California I want to say this is probably in the 60s or the 70s. If you like that time period, this might be a good pick for you. If you like kind of jerk main characters, this might be a pick for you. Next up, we have The Posthumous Memories of Bras Cubas, and you might be saying to yourself, that's not the title. The title is Epitaph of a Small Winter by Machado de Assis. You would be wrong. That is not the title of this book. The title of this book is The Posthumous Memories of Bras Cubas. Why they chose to rename this book, I will never understand. Now, the title, Epitaph of a Small Winter, is pulled from a line in this book. Why they chose to change the title completely to a line in the book from what it actually was is beyond me. I hate it. I take personal offense. It's vitriolic, and I want to throw up. Now, The Posthumous Memories of Bras Cubas. This book is so good. I found this in a Salvation Army for 55 cents. I saw the cover and I knew something. I knew something was going to be special here. The real title of this book kind of says it all. It is a posthumous autobiography. It is about a man named Bras Cubas who died and is telling us about his life from his perspective after death. I don't think I can say any more than that. This is a must-read. This is so good. Next up, we have High Tide in Tucson, another Barbara Kingsolver. This is an early book for her. I was trying to go chronological with a lot of her books that I hadn't read before. This is a collection of essays. There's some really good ones in here. She talks about motherhood. She talks about gardening, the environment, the planet, species going extinct. She's interested in a lot of really important things and the intersection of those things aforementioned. A lot about motherhood, a lot about living in Tucson, Arizona. This is good. Would definitely recommend this. I don't think there's any Kingsolver that I wouldn't recommend. Next up, we have Henry James's The Turn of the Screw and other short fiction. I imagine a lot of people have probably heard of The Turn of the Screw. There have been film and television adaptations. It is about children living in a large mansion and a governess taking care of them who is uncertain of whether they are little demons or not. It's a classic of early horror fiction. It's so good. There are a couple other stories in here. Washington Square, Daisy Miller, The Beast in the Jungle, and The Jolly Corner. I really like The Beast in the Jungle. I had read that many years ago. This is my first real pickup of a Henry James, and yeah, he's so well known for a reason. This is fantastic. Would definitely recommend any of the stories in this collection. Next up, we have Child of God by Cormac McCarthy. I've read a couple Cormac McCarthy's before this one. This is another early pick. I find that I like his earlier work better. Outer Dark, I think, is still the favorite of the 4 or 5 that I've read. This is about a man named Lester Ballard who gets out of jail at the start of the book, and he basically roams the countryside of Tennessee doing some really messed up stuff. I'm gonna leave it there. He's well known for his really unique style. He's heavily inspired by Faulkner, as so many people are, and I think he writes in a way that you either love or hate. I know people who love his writing like me. I know other people who hate his writing unlike me. He's hit or miss. I would say give him a try. You can't go wrong picking up one of his better known books like The Road. Not my favorite personally, but trying him in some way, shape, or form I think is worth it. Next we have David Foster Wallace's Consider the Lobster. Now this is a book I had on the shelf for a good while. A friend of mine, same friend who recommended The Unconsoled, wanted me to read this. It is a collection of essays. Some of the essays in here are things that I think are going to stick with me for the rest of my life, and I'll end up rereading a couple things from this collection. He writes in such a unique way. He's got footnotes that take up full pages. He's got pages that should be a footnote in and of themselves, but he picks really interesting things to write about. He writes about tennis stars. He writes about the campaign trail following John McCain. He writes about a sex worker convention. There's a lot going on in here. He's got a beautiful essay about Dostoevsky in here. He's got a beautiful essay about different editions of dictionaries, and yes, that doesn't sound interesting, but yes, it is interesting. He is a technician at his finest. He knew how to write, I should say. He is no longer with us, but he knew how to write in a way that I rarely see in anyone else. Consider the Lobster. I used to be a Mainer, so him writing about the lobsters in Maine is a cool thing too. Next we have 2 books by Jeanette Winterson. This is The Passion and Written on the Body. And let me just say, I had never read her before. Oh my god, will I be reading her more after this? I'm gonna start with the second of the 2 that I read, Written on the Body. I should not have read this right after reading The Passion. I've learned that when I love a book, I shouldn't just read more from that writer, because it will be hard to love more. And I don't know if that makes sense, but I'll explain what I mean in a second. This is beautiful. It is about an unknown relationship between 2 people. First-person narration. It is cryptic, but beautiful, and cryptic in a way that never really matters. The narrator is unnamed, they are ungendered, we don't really know much about them, but we hear things from their perspective and how they navigate relationships. Jeanette Winterson, her prose is so beautiful, and the way she writes romances is like nothing I've ever read before. And the reason that I say I desperately need to read this again, and that I should not read 2 books from the same writer in a row when I loved the first one, is because I read this, and this is one of my favorite books I have ever read now. This is about a chicken cook for Napoleon, and a cross-dressing gambling attendant who fall in love. And I can't say any more without giving too much away. This is one of the best books I've ever read. The prose is immaculate. The structure is immaculate. The romance is immaculate. The characters are amazing. What? I never knew how much I would enjoy historical fiction, and then I picked this up and it changed my life. Reading this right after it was a mistake because I was so enthralled by this that I was not able to fully engage with this, and that's a shame because this is probably just as good. I am schwitzing. I should not have sat in the sun. This was a mistake. If I ever do this again, I will be sitting somewhere else. Next up, more Kobo Abe. This is The Box Man. This is about a guy who gets into a cardboard box and decides he wants to stay in the cardboard box for the rest of his life. He has a home, he gives it up. He has a job, he gives it up. He has prospects, he gives them up. He goes to live in the box. If it wasn't clear by now, Kobo Abe takes on some really, really interesting and weird topics. He writes a bit in the absurd. He writes a bit in the, what is the best word? Kafka-esque. There we go, that's a good word for today. I think I liked this more than The Ruin Map. Structurally, it's a puzzle. Still wouldn't say it's his best, but definitely worth trying if you've tried him before and you like him. Next up is Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. Once again, a book that changed my life. I don't think I need to speak about Toni Morrison, right? I think anybody and their mother probably knows who she is. This is about Milkman and his life and navigating different relationships with family, with friends, with race, with legacy and lineage. I don't know how to describe this book without giving away too much. She will come up more again on this list. We can talk about her more. Oh my god. Next up is The Doctor's Wife by Sawako Ariyoshi. I'm gonna be perfectly honest, I bought this because the cover was cool and I cannot recommend this one, I'm so sorry. This is a mother-daughter relationship when folks are getting sick, when a husband is trying to do medical work. They make some strange and interesting sacrifices. I don't think the prose was very strong. I don't think it was very engaging. It's a shame because I think there was a lot more potential here and I just don't think it delivered. I'm pretty sure this was based slightly on a true story, and maybe that true story is more engaging than this narrative was, but I'm sorry, Ariyoshi, I just wasn't in love with this. Sorry, please forgive me. Next up is more of Willa Cather. This is My Antonia. I loved this. I feel like his Antonia is now my Antonia. This is about a young boy whose name escapes me because I read this so many months ago, who makes friends with another young woman named Antonia in the plains of Nebraska. People struggle, people starve, and this is about this boy's life and his encounters with Antonia as she struggles, as she toils, as she lives, not quite alongside him, but adjacent to him through different experiences. I really felt connected to these characters. I really, really like Willa Cather's prose, and it makes me keep coming back for more. Out of water. Water, 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 water. Next up is The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. What a surprise. This is one of her best known, maybe even her best known. It took a while for me to pick this one up. I read a lot of her other books before trying this. This is about an American family who goes to live in the Congo as missionaries, essentially, with a crazy father, a gaggle of daughters, a mother who is harrowed by the circumstances she finds herself in. It is really, really deeply rooted in historical context of the Belgian Congo in, I want to say, like the 1950s, 1960s. The political unrest, the political turmoil there. I definitely learned a lot from this book. I really ought to read some actual historical accounts and not just this fiction take on it, but this is beautiful. It's heartbreaking, it's engaging, it's enthralling. I love Kingsolver's writing, so it's not a hard sell for me to pick up another thing by her. I don't think this is my favorite, but I can see why this is one of her best known books. The way she handles the historical material is pretty solid. I'm pretty sure it's based slightly on personal experience. Her father, or both of her parents, were either missionaries or teachers or aid workers, and they lived in the Congo when she was younger for some period of time. So this does come from a bit of personal experience and an interest and desire to speak on behalf of folks who maybe don't have a voice. I'm always concerned in that way with white savior complex. I will say this is far from the first and far from the last time that Kingsolver writes sort of on behalf of other folks who have less of a voice than her. It never feels like she comes off as a white savior. It never feels like she's mistreating the material or disrespectful of the peoples that she's speaking for and about, and I do really appreciate that about her writing. She's very careful about that, and you can see over the course of her career and her works that she learns more and more how to treat material of this kind in a respectful and engaging way. I really recommend her. I think she's worth trying. You could even pick up a slim volume. You could pick up something trendy. You could pick up something easy. Her books are really easy to get into. The prose is straightforward. It's not complex. Next up, we have Damian by Hermann Hesse. Surprise, more of him on this list. This is one of his earlier works. It is about a boy named Emile Sinclair. A lot of Hermann Hesse's work, it's introspective, it's rich, it's very much about the self and the heart and the brain and how we connect to ourselves, how we understand ourselves in relation to the world, to other people, to society, to nature. Siddhartha is really, really inclined towards self and nature and self and self. I don't know if that's a relationship you really describe. This is a really, really cool book. Next up, When We Were Orphans, another Kazuo Ishiguro. For the sake of not being too harsh, I'm going to keep this brief. I don't like this book. I don't like the characters. I don't like the story. I don't like the treatment of the material. I don't like what it was saying. I don't like what it was doing. I don't like much of anything about this book. Talking about him earlier, he is someone who really reflects and takes these characters, makes them introspective, makes them consider things. How did I think about these things before? How am I thinking about them now? How can I hide myself from the truth and choose not to believe things to keep myself safe? That's what he does in a lot of his books. I think he does it in this one more than any other, and I think it is wildly unsuccessful. This is about a man who, he lives in Britain. He travels back to Shanghai to try and find his parents. If you have been reading this book up to the point where he returns to Shanghai, you will, I'm sorry, this is a bit of a spoiler. It's a spoiler warning. You will know immediately that there is no hope of him finding his parents. It's a man deluding himself into believing things, and I think there's power in what this book wanted to say, but I think it says it so poorly that I was just infuriated when I put it down. Next up, we have The Wall by Marlene Hasshofer. I hope I'm saying that okay. This is about a woman who goes to visit some friends on a farm in the remote mountains and plains, and a sort of wall, if you will, descends around the area of the farm and traps her there. She is alone. There is no one else. The entire world may be dead for all she knows, but she is alone. She has a cow and a cat, and I think there was a dog, and she has to learn how to survive. This is so good. So good. It's a story of survival. It's a story of selfhood. It's a story of self in relation to the land, to the earth, how we keep ourselves alive, how we feel about keeping ourselves alive. This was a gift from my partner, and she hit the nail on the head. Next up, we have Camus' Exile in the Kingdom. This is a collection of short stories. I think I read it a little too fast, to be fair to him. I didn't connect with a lot of these stories, but I think there was a lot more going on under the hood that I didn't take away from this because I went through it too quickly. I read this in a day. I should have given it another day. Knowing the relationship I had to the fall, I should have seen more in this, I think, and I think I didn't let myself see as much as there probably was. Next, we have John Williams' Stoner. Yeah, I'm just gonna say it outright. This is another favorite book of all time. This was a recommendation from a friend. It is about a man named Stoner who falls in love with literature, becomes a professor, and tries to live a life of letters, of reading, of writing, of research, of study, of contemplation. A lot of things get in his way, namely family, difficult relationships. This book is, how do I even describe this? The first 50 pages of this book, I think I struggled to see what made my friend recommend it. Because sure, you know, a man who falls in love with literature and wants to study and be a part of that world and make that world his own. I think that's a wonderful and interesting thing in and of itself. But I think I struggled for about 50 pages to see what made this book special, and I think something clicked at a certain point. The prose is nothing special. It's very, very straightforwardly written. The characters are not really anything crazy. This book, on the surface, is not doing anything remarkable. But I think when I stopped to think about it for just a second, everything sort of clicked into place for me to realize how special this book is to me, and how special this book is in general. There's something about the combination of simple, straightforward prose and the way the characters are treated and handled and written that is just so special. I think the treatment of a man who goes through so much, who just lets so much happen to him, not for better, allows himself to take the brunt of so much negativity in his own life, and seemingly does nothing about it, just wants to study. Let me pull a quote. Like all lovers, they spoke much of themselves, as if they might thereby understand the world which made them possible. It's a fantastic, introspective look at how relationships affect us, how we let relationships affect us, how we affect others through relationships, and how a pursuit of something as simple and straightforward as reading and writing can be so important and so impactful. Next up, we have George Eliot's Scenes of Clerical Life. This is her first publication. It is a collection of novellas. I'd read this before in a different edition. I picked up a second edition to try and read it again because I left my first one in the rain. I really love George Eliot. I've read 3 or 4 of her books now, and I wanted to reread this one because it made such a mark on me when I was younger. I read it when I was maybe 16 or 17. She writes English pastorals. She writes character introspectives. She's a master of writing character, and she's a master of interrelations between characters. If you don't know her, I don't know what you're doing, honestly, but love this book. Next, we have Edgar Lee Masters' The Spoon River Anthology. This was a surprise. I love this book. So similar to The Posthumous Memories of Bras Cubas, that was a book, about a person telling us about his life post-mortem. This is similar. This is an anthology of voices from the dead. So it's folks talking to us from beyond the grave, telling us about their lives in this tiny little town of Spoon River. This is really, really cool. I'm finding that I really enjoy narratives told in this way. They're all told through just these little blocks of verse for every person. I'm gonna pick one out. Penniwit the artist. I lost my patronage in Spoon River from trying to put my mind in the camera, to catch the soul of the person. The very best picture I ever took was of Judge Summers, attorney at law. He sat upright and had me pause till he got his cross eyes straight. Then he was ready, he said, "All right," and I yelled, "Overruled," and his eye turned up, and I caught him just as he used to look when saying, "I accept." Next up, we have Friday Black by, I want to get your name right, Nanakwame Ajayi-Brinya. I had heard of one of these stories before. I think it was a Jacob Geller video essay. I can't remember which one. I'll try and find out. This is a short story collection. This is a debut. This has got to be up there as one of my favorite short story collections. This is amazing. The Finkelstein Five, The Lion and the Spider, Through the Flash, a couple of the narratives actually play into each other. He studied with George Saunders, who is a pretty well-known writer. I've read some of his short stories. It shows. His style of prose is very clearly and heavily inspired by George Saunders. To me, I don't think that's a good thing. I'm gonna be completely frank here. I don't care very much for George Saunders' writing. I don't think he's very skilled as a prose writer, and I don't think many of his narratives really work for me. I think they often fall flat even when he has an interesting idea. I think he is a better writer than George Saunders, which is really cool because he clearly learned from him and took everything that George Saunders does well and did it even better in my opinion. The Finkelstein Five is amazing. It's probably going to be up there as one of my favorite short stories I've ever read. Here we've got a little bit of, well, I say a little bit, of Richard Brautigan. So he's a little bit well known for this one. A little bit, I say. This is Trout Fishing in America, The Pill versus the Spring Hill Mine Disaster, and In Watermelon Sugar. 3 books in one collection. A friend had been telling me to read Trout Fishing in America for years. It's got this really well-known back cover that just says, mayonnaise. This won't be the first Brautigan on this list, and it won't be the last. My favorite of the 3 was In Watermelon Sugar. Very, very American, very, very West Coast. I think if you just look a picture of Richard Brautigan on the cover, it kind of tells you everything you need to know about what you're getting into in his writing. That plus mayonnaise is pretty much all you need to know. The 1930s will never come again, but his shoes were wet with dew. They'll stay that way in marble. Next up, we have Fall on Your Knees. I steer clear, generally, of books that have the Oprah seal of approval on them. I don't trust Oprah. I'm kidding. I have no qualms with Oprah except the fact that she diverts. We're not gonna get into that. You make your own opinion of Oprah. A small bar/book club opened in my town, and I wanted to check it out, so I bought this book. This is, I'm just gonna say it, way too long. How long was this? 508 pages. This should have been about 300 pages. I very rarely say should have been because I don't like to judge, pun intended, a book in that way. I like to speak about a thing for what it is, you know? And I will speak about all 508 pages of this book. This did not need to be this long, that's all I'm gonna say. There's like a 150 page section in the middle of this book that could have been like 50 pages. and it just keeps going for like a really, really long time. This is about a family living on Cape Breton Island off the coast of Nova Scotia. How do I even describe this book? I'm gonna read you the back. The Piper family is steeped in secrets, lies, and unspoken truths. At the eye of the storm is one secret that threatens to shake their lives and even destroy them. It is a family epic spanning many generations. I think the ending is satisfying. I think overall the narrative is very well written and the characters are endearing, interesting, and engaging. I just think it's too long. Whoa! Next up is another back-to-back. This is Jim Harrison's Dalva and Jim Harrison's The Road Home. I found The Road Home in a little free library down the street from me. I don't know what it was about this cover that just kind of spoke to me. And there is something on the back of this book when I went to pick it up to read it that basically just says like, read Dalva first, and went, okay, I guess I'm going online and I'm getting Dalva. One of my new favorite writers. I had never heard of him before, and I am so glad. Like, this is the beauty of a little free library, is finding a writer you've never heard of who is now one of your favorite writers, period. Dalva is about a woman named Dalva. We kind of scrape through 3 different parts of the story. The first is Dalva's perspective. The second is, I think his name is Michael. And the third is Dalva's perspective yet again. It is about a family who has a ranch in Nebraska. Dalva lives in California. She travels back to that ranch in Nebraska. There are certain family secrets, there are certain connections that this family has to Native American wars and conflicts of the past. I think the storytelling in here is just beautiful. I fell in love in this book. It's so good. Moving into The Road Home. Is that what it's called? Yeah, The Road Home. This is told from even more perspectives. So you get more perspectives of family members that you meet in Dalva, and you get to learn more about the things that are sort of began in Dalva, expounded upon in much greater depth and detail. It's difficult to say which of these books is better or that I like more because I kind of think of them as one experience. The style of writing in this book is almost identical to the one of Dalva. It's really cool. You don't really hear from Dalva in this book, but you learn about her. You don't get to hear much from her, but you learn more about her through the other folks in the same way that this book does the opposite. You hear from Dalva and you learn about the other people. I love learning about the Northridge family. I love learning about their connections. It's another writer who, his treatment of Indigenous culture and the way he writes about them and talks about them is very respectful, very admiring. Or Toni Morrison, The Bluest Eye. This is a reread for me. I had read this in 2023 and I wanted to pick up Beloved, but I thought about The Bluest Eye and realized that I needed to read it again. I had read Song of Solomon earlier this year and realized I needed to read The Bluest Eye again before I tried another book from Morrison. Very worth rereading. This is fantastic. Every Toni Morrison is fantastic. This is about a girl who wishes she had blue eyes, and I can't really say much more. It's a non-linear narrative, which I'm a sucker for when it's done well. It's kind of wild. I think this is her first book, and it's so strong, and it spells out such an immaculate career that everyone knows and most of them love. Next up is another back-to-back. This is Zora Neale Hurston with Their Eyes Were Watching God and Dust Tracks on a Road. This is a beautiful, beautiful narrative of a woman named Janie who is traveling. She's traveling. She goes out, she lives her life, she works, she learns, she experiences catastrophe, but she comes out on top. A really triumphant narrative that gives a lot of agency to the main character, except in one peculiar sense that I bet there's a lot of discourse out there about that I've yet to uncover. Dust Tracks on a Road it's an autobiography of Zora Neale Hurston that is slightly fictitious. I was thinking of that Weird Al Yankovic like biopic that came out a couple of years ago. I think it starred Daniel Radcliffe. It's like a normal biopic for a while, and then it just takes a turn where you realize like he's no longer talking about his own life and he's just like making up a story. I think about that to a less extreme extent here because I think it's pretty clear that not everything she writes about is true, or she stretches the details of certain things to encompass a story that she wished to tell about herself and about other people. I think I actually liked it more than Their Eyes Were Watching God, but both are really great for their own reasons. Next, we have A Flag for Sunrise by, what is your name? Robert Stone. Admittedly, once again, picked it up because I thought the cover was nice. It's a beautiful blue. I love things about this book. I don't love others about it. It's told from the perspective of several different characters exploring a fictional country called Tekon and just the political unrest in that country, how these different characters interact with each other as they meet over their different narratives, how those interactions shape the political sphere of the country, and how the revolution going on in that country is kind of shaped by strange circumstances. It's a cool read. I think it's pretty long for what it is. It's 430 something pages, I want to say. I wished more than anything that he really delved into this fictional country of Dakan more. It starts to get really interesting towards the end when there's not a whole lot left to give. I definitely enjoyed it, and I definitely enjoy the days that I gave it, but I don't know that I would read this again. Next up, we have Pale Fire, Vladimir Nabokov. This is insane. This book is insane. What is the word for it? Literature of exhaustion. I think that's the term for the way that he approaches a book like this. It's a book that's bored with the conventional novel. It's a book that takes the idea of a novel and explodes it in so many ways that it hardly looks like a novel anymore, but is one of the best things you've ever read in your entire life. As soon as I put this down, I felt like I needed to pick it up again. Just to tell you a little about the structure. It opens with a foreword about the book. It goes into an epic poem. That epic poem is then explicated by a man named Kimbot, and that explication is cited by about half the book, filled up with footnotes. Half the book is footnotes. This book is a commentary on a commentary on a commentary on a commentary. If you've never read Nabokov, do not pick this up first. It's a lot. This was my 4th or 5th Nabokov, and I can confidently say it still baffled me, it still amazed me, and it still needs like 10 more rereads. Next we have some Robert Frost. This is A Boy's Will and North of Boston. There were some really beautiful poems in this collection. I surprisingly didn't know a lot of Robert Frost outside of the really, really obvious and famous ones, and I'm glad I read some more. This is The Summer Book by Tove Jansson. I think I'm saying that okay. She is the creator of Moomin. It's about a child and their grandmother who live on this island. More of their family is there, but it's about their relationships with each other, about how they are grumpy with each other, and their adventures and the way they live their lives and just explore summer on this island. It's really, really sweet. I think she has another one called The Winter Book. I would love to try that out. Her writing is just, it's magic. Moomin is magic. Anybody who's seen Moomin or read Moomin would know that. A little chilly in here. Alrighty, where were we? Next up, we have some Shakespeare, A Midsummer Night's Dream. I've read a couple Shakespeare's when I was younger. I've been wanting to get into a little bit more of him again. I liked a lot of the characters. I think the scene direction is, what am I talking about scene direction? Like I know what I'm talking about in a Shakespeare play. Bah! It's a fun play. I'm not gonna say any more about it. We're gonna move on. Next we have our 3rd Ishiguro for the year. This is Never Let Me Go. Oh boy, guys, I'm gonna be honest with you. Every time I read a new book by Kazuo Ishiguro, I tell myself I'm not going to read him again because I don't enjoy his writing. I really like The Unconsoled. I want to reread that. I'm not really... I think this is his most read book. What do people see in this? I know this is just gonna sound mean, but like, what? The characters are so uninteresting. The plot is so uninteresting. The prose is utterly, bafflingly boring. What do people see in this? The reveal isn't even all that interesting. I like the subtlety of the reveal. I like once again, the themes that are going on here. I like what it's getting at. I like the idea of the persistence of memory and how it affects our lives. I like the struggles that we go through in these personal relationships when we don't know if we're really truly ourselves. But it's so weird because I love The Unconsoled, and I know that's the black sheep of his, oeuvre or his bibliography, but like, what is this? Why do people like this? I would really, really like to know why people like this. And I could probably go online and read reviews. I don't really do that, but if you have any interest and you are still watching, please tell me in the comments why you like this book, if you've read it, what you find engaging about it, because I simply don't understand. Next, we have Cloud Atlas, David Mitchell. I saw the Wachowski sisters movie a long time ago when I was younger and it came out. I really, really enjoyed the movie and I'd wanted to read the book for years. This is great. I'm glad I did. I know people really, really love this one. It is a collection of tales from different narrators that kind of interweave upon themselves. You leave halfway through one tale to encounter another, and those tales keep spiraling in on each other. They have interesting connections to each other. Narratively, it's unique. I'm not gonna say it's groundbreaking, but I think anyone who reads this would connect with some stories more than others. I certainly did. My favorite, I think, is the central story. The one that, once you get to the center of all 6, plays out in its entirety before moving back upon itself towards the other stories. There is a lyrical movement to this book. It's really, really beautiful. I think it's worth reading. It's about 500 pages. Infinitely better than the movie, although I'd really like to rewatch the movie because there's some good actors in it. But this is great. This is Zadie Smith's Intimations. Now, this is my first Zadie Smith. Probably not a good choice. This was not very good. She wrote these little intimations. I think it was during 2020 when COVID hit. They're not very good. I'm just gonna leave it at that because I don't want to harp on things that I dislike that hard. This was not really engaging to me. It's a one sitting read. It's less than 100 pages and they're very short, but maybe I'll try another Zadie Smith to actually understand what makes her so well known, but this was not a good introduction for me, I'm sorry to say. Next is our third Toni Morrison for the year. It was Beloved. As I had mentioned earlier, I reread The Bluest Eye before getting into this. Gave a little bit of time before picking this up. I don't even know how to talk about her. Again, everybody knows Toni Morrison. Everybody knows her work. This book is haunting, challenging, immaculate. I mean, I don't think it was my personal favorite of hers out of the three I've read. That is Song of Solomon for me. But this book is, it's just wild and rare to use the word masterpiece. It's a masterpiece. Like, what else do you say about this? What do you say about Toni Morrison that has not already been said? I don't feel equipped to talk about her in a more meaningful way than you could probably find at other places in literature and on the internet. I'm gonna leave it there. Like, she's frickin' Toni Morrison. Just like read this book. It's insane. Next we have, what is this, like the fourth Barbara Kingsolver? This is Prodigal Summer. This is like the third time I've reread this book. I love this book. This is my second favorite of hers, only trumped by Animal Dreams. I don't know if that's really a big fave. I don't know a lot of people who read her books in real life, so I haven't spoken to her many people about her. I love this book. It's a comfort read for me. I've been reading it and rereading it in the summer. It interweaves three different stories from people who live in the mountains of, pretty sure it's North Carolina. No, I think it's Virginia. I think it's the mountains in Virginia on this fictional mountain called Mount Zebulon and the town of Zebulon. There is a rough and tumble woman named Deanna Wolf who is studying coyotes in the woods. She's a park ranger. There is Lusa Maloof Landowski, who is a moth biologist. There's probably a word for that I'm getting wrong. She inherits a family home and is dealing with the family whose home she inherited. And there is Garnet Walker the third or fourth, a curmudgeonly old man who is breeding American chestnut trees to find a strain that can withstand the blight. Kingsolver moved to Appalachia. Might have been Virginia. She might live in Virginia. I don't remember. The first book she wrote when she moved there was The Poisonwood Bible, which I talked about earlier. She later read this, oh my god, she wrote this one. She wrote this book. She did not read it. I hope she reread it after she read it, but she wrote this book after moving there. Super inspired by her experiences living there. It's such a fun read. It's such a comfort read for me. I really, really love this one. Next up, a third Willa Cather for the year. I think this was the last one. This is Death Comes for the Archbishop. Again, I love these old vintage editions. This is just a beautiful cover for me. This has got to be my favorite of the three of hers that I've read. This is about an archbishop who moves to New Mexico sometime in the 19th century, and it's about his life living there and traveling to different places. It's about his best friend in the clergy who moves with him. If you've read her, you may have read this one. This is a beautiful book. I am going to reread this so many times for so many years. Next, we have another Jamaica Kincaid. This is Annie John. I find that I never really have much to say about her. It's sort of what I said about Lucy earlier. She tells stories about women coming into their own and learning about themselves and understanding themselves in lives that are not suited for them to actually learn in that way. It's about a young girl named Annie John living in Antigua, where Jamaica Kincaid herself is from. I don't think I would say this is the best of her books that I've read. She's a tricky one because I find that her writing, or like her prose itself, is not all that strong, but I kind of get sucked in nonetheless. So I don't know, take that for what you will. I don't think any of her books are a bad place to start. Also, I find it really weird. There's just nothing on the spine of this book. I don't know why. Like, I have other books from the publisher Noonday, and they don't do this on other books, so like, I'm not sure what's up with that. She just got a blank spine, so sorry, Annie. Look at you! You want to hang out and check out the books with us? Up next, we have Mishima's The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. This is my first Mishima. Is it my first Mishima? That's a lie. What am I talking about? I read The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. That book is fantastic. If you have not read Yukio Mishima's The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, please read that. We're not talking about that today, though. We're talking about The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. What are you doing? These are gonna fall. I think I just have to let the title speak for itself. This is a hard book to talk about. It's depressing. It's about a sailor who falls in love with a woman. That woman has a son named Noboru. The relationship between the son Noboru and the sailor is really at the crux of this book. Can you not knock this entire stack of books over, please? Thank you very much. If you want a relatively wild and effed up story, and one that will leave you thinking about it and dreaming about it for a very long time. Picked this up. The cover itself, I think, is really beautiful and weirdly expresses a lot of what this book is saying. If you read it, I think you'll know what I mean. I will just say as a postscript there, Mishima is a very well-known Japanese writer. He committed seppuku at the publication of his final book in a tetralogy he was writing. I think any of his books speak to how amazing of a writer he was. Again, I would recommend The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. That is about a young monk who becomes obsessed with a temple. And yes, it is as good as it sounds. Check that one out. Check this one out. Next up is Breakfast at Tiffany's by Truman Capote. I loved this book. I read The Grass Harp and a collection of short stories from him in 2023. And I liked some of those stories, but I wasn't in love. This sold me. And there's a couple other stories in here as well that I really enjoyed, especially The Diamond Guitar. That one's really good too. Yeah, Breakfast at Tiffany's, it's about Holly Golightly. It's about a woman moving to New York and trying to escape a past that she doesn't believe in and reinventing herself. It's a beautiful story. The prose is beautiful. I've got In Cold Blood on the shelf and I'm really excited to read that. Next, we have Steinbeck's Tortilla Flat. This is about a group of friends in Monterey, California. And as the back cover really well says, they live in a shabby district of Tortilla Flat inhabited by a colorful gang whose revels recall the exploits of King Arthur's knights. It's a funny group of pals, kind of being jerks to each other but loving each other at the same time, drinking far too much wine, doing basically nothing else. There's a character in here named Danny. I love Danny. There's a character whose name escapes me. Big Joe Portagee. Big Joe Portagee, I love you. Big Joe Portagee, my soulmate. This is an interesting little romp. I think Steinbeck, again, is another love it or hate it writer. If you've read him, you probably know what I mean. Next up we have, and I realize you can't see it, Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes. I left this on the cover because a friend from an old job gave me this book and I really liked it, so I left it on there. This is my first Bradbury. I've never read Fahrenheit 451. I've never read The Halloween Tree. This is it, Something Wicked. I always think of that moment in one of the Harry Potter movies where all of the kids are in the choir and they're holding big toads and they're singing Something Wicked This Way Comes. And that's what I think of with this book. This is about two friends. I believe they live in rural Illinois. A carnival comes to town and really wacky stuff ensues. Magical elements ensue. The kids are scared. The kids are brave. There's a special something to his writing. It's hard to describe because I think you could hand this to a kid and they'd really, really enjoy this. Like, seriously, if I was 12, I would have loved this book. I still loved it in my mid-20s, but so engaging, and he writes this absolutely amazing scene where the father of one of the kids is just like the coolest character in any book I've ever read. Next up, we have The Beautiful Struggle by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is autobiographical. I don't read a lot of autobiography, but man, this was beautiful. It's in the title. This was beautiful. This was so beautiful. I had this on the shelf for a couple of years. I didn't know what I was getting into. It is about this man, Ta-Nehisi. Can I help you? Can I help you? It's hard to say it's purely autobiographical because he talks so much about his family, especially his father. But this is coming of age. This is about him as he grows up, his relationships to these people in his life, how his father, more than anyone, has shaped who he is, for better and for worse, and for abundance and lack. Again, beautiful. This is really, really beautiful. Next up, we have another Jim Harrison. This is The Woman Lit by Fireflies. It is a short story? No, I guess it's a novella collection. I guess they're novellas. It encompasses Brown Dog, Sunset Limited, and The Woman Lit by Fireflies. I would say Brown Dog is my favorite and the strongest of the three stories here. I don't think this was as strong as Galva and The Road Home as kind of a pairing of novels together, but I do really like the voices in these stories, especially Brown Dog and The Sunset Limited. I think The Woman Lit by Fireflies, the eponymous one, is a little more disappointing. I don't think it was as strong as the other two stories. I'm pretty sure he took the story of Brown Dog and built a larger work or like a novel or many short stories about this character out of it. I would love to check those out because that one on its own was really, really engaging. Next up, we have Adania Shibley's, am I getting your name right? Yes, Adania Shibley's Minor Detail. This is a slim little volume, just about 100 pages. This is like required reading. This is incredible and haunting. It's about a woman living in Palestine. She learns of some minor details of a story about a woman who was raped and killed by army officers in the year of 1949. She learns about this story and she wants to understand it more. And she goes on a small journey across Palestine to try and uncover a little bit more about these minor details. This is incredible. This has got to be one of the tightest pieces of 99 pages of writing that I've ever read. It's almost meandering in its way, and the prose itself it's sparse. It's sparse, and it almost pulls the detail out of itself. And I think those minor details speak for themselves so loudly and so powerfully. Next, we have Frank Herbert's Whipping Star. Everybody knows Frank Herbert. They know him for Dune. I have not read Dune. I've got Dune on the shelf, and I would like to pick it up at some point. A gift from the friend who also gave me Something Wicked This Way Comes. This is really cool. This was a reread for me. I had read it a year or two before. It's not very long. It's less than 200 pages. I don't know what Herbert's prose is like in the Dune series, and I don't know what it's like in his other work. I am a novice when it comes to science fiction, but I need to read more because I'm really interested in reading more science fiction, writing a little bit of myself. I don't think this book would be for everyone. This is technical. This is technical sci-fi, if I've understood that right. It is about a creature called a Caliban. It's seemingly the last of its kind. It's going to die, and if it dies, it may take all of humanity with it. I love this book enough for a reread, of course. The way it plays with language and semantics and how unreliable communication can be between even people of our own kind and people who understand each other, it's really cool. It's really, really cool. Next up, we have Haruki Murakami's South of the Border, West of the Sun. I will say, I love this cover. It is stunning. A lot of the new Murakamis I don't think look very good in Vintage International, but these ones, gorgeous. I want to be very clear here. I am not speaking out of a place of inexperience. People love Haruki Murakami. Like, he's the best-selling Japanese writer of all time, I'm pretty sure. Unless you count Eiichiro Oda, the creator of One Piece, because I think he's the best-selling Japanese writer of all time. But for books and not manga, I believe he's the best-selling. Guys, I don't get it. And I want to be clear here, I have read 5.5 of his books. Like I am not speaking from like, oh, I read this one and I didn't like it and whatever. Like, no, I've read a bunch. I've read like a half dozen of his books, okay? I give him so many tries and I just don't get it. He writes these really interesting setups and then they never deliver. They never deliver. I will say, I read Norwegian Wood. That is probably the favorite out of the ones I've read, and this is maybe my second favorite out of the books I've given a go. I didn't hate this book. I didn't hate this book. I think I read it in a day. It's not very long. It's funny because every one of his stories kind of melds together in my mind, and I tend to forget the details pretty quickly. This is about I'm just gonna read the back to you. Hajime, born in an affluent Tokyo suburb, has arrived at middle age wanting for almost nothing. The post-war years have brought him a fine marriage, 2 daughters, and an enviable career as a proprietor of 2 jazz clubs. Yet a nagging sense of inauthenticity about his success threatens his happiness, and a boyhood memory of a wise, lonely girl clouds his heart. In a similar fashion to Ishiguro, he writes a lot about memory. He writes about how characters can interact with each other and awaken things in each other. He often writes about how relationships can span a lifetime. So like, there's tons of books by him where like, characters met each other when they were kids. They didn't see each other for like 50 years, but like they meet again and they're like soulmates or something. He writes about that like all the time. That's very much part of this book as well. I think this one is pretty solid, and I think Norwegian Wood was solid. I really don't get him. Maybe I just don't get what people love about him so much. I think he's not very good at wrapping up a story. I find it so underwhelming oftentimes. Whenever I finish one of his books, I'm just kind of left like, that was it? And I still felt that in this one, but I don't think I felt it as strongly as others like Sputnik Sweetheart or The Wind-Up Bird Chronicles or most of the stories in Men Without Women. He's not for me, guys. I'm sorry. He's not for me. And yet I just keep trying more. I have Hard-Boiled Wonderland on the shelf, and I'll probably read it. I'll probably read it because I always try more, and I don't know why I do it. It's like 6 or 7 books at this point. I don't know. I could be reading anything else, but I keep trying him. I'm done. I'm done. I've got to stop talking about him. I'm done. So a little more of Vladimir Nabokov. This is Mary. This is his first book, actually. And can I just say, I love these Vintage International editions. I think they're just beautiful. Anytime I see one in the store that I don't have in this edition, I pick them up because I just think they're so cool. They really capture a lot of what makes his writing, and I think they're just really on brand for him with the butterflies and the patterns and the chess pieces. This is his first novel. This is about Russian emigres living in a boarding house, their relations to each other, and how several of the characters double back in on this one person named Mary. There's no bad Nabokov in my 5 or 6 books I've read from him in my experience. He doesn't write bad books. Being his first book, it's very pared back compared to a lot of other things that he's written and a lot of things that I've read by him. But nonetheless, like, you can see all the pieces there, you know? And I've read a couple of his early books as well, besides this one, like The Lose in Defense and like Despair. It's really cool to see where he started with publication. You know, his Russian books versus his, you know, books written in English when he was living in America and Switzerland. There's a very marked difference when he was writing in Russian versus when he was writing directly in English, and I know he worked on a lot of his own translations in his lifetime. I don't know if he did this one or not. If you like Nabokov and you haven't read some of his earlier stuff, and you've been more into like the Lolitas and the Pale Fires and the Penins, give this a try. This is cool. It's cool to see where he began. Next up, we have Germinal by Emile Zola. You know, for a 500-page book about people living in a mining town, he says so much. And I know he's got like dozens and dozens of books kind of detailing similar things and how the working class rises up, the creation of the working class in France. I was really, really into this. I'd like to read more of him. I saw a couple secondhand copies at a local bookstore that I'd probably want to pick up. A lot of characters are really endearing. I think the main character, his name Etienne, it might be Etienne, trying to kind of drive revolution. He's so uncertain of himself and he doesn't really know what he's doing. I love the way that character is written. I love the way this story moves through different parts of town and it uses the actual underground itself to speak metaphorically and literally about the conditions. It's really cool. Next, we have James Baldwin's short story collection, Going to Meet the Man. This is my favorite short story collection I've ever read. This was a reread. It was my first James Baldwin I read probably in like 2016 or 2017. If you haven't heard of James Baldwin, what is going on? Where do you live? Do you live under the rock pile? Do you live under the rock pile? You know him. I don't need to talk. You know him. It's fine. You know him. If you've read any short stories from James Baldwin, you may have in fact read Sonny's Blues. Sonny's Blues is my favorite short story of all time. It's about a pianist named Sonny who has his troubles with drugs, has his trouble with the law, but he loves to play. And he has a brother who doesn't quite understand him. There is so much in this one story. I could talk for a day. Read this collection, read Sonny's Blues, cry like I have. Next up, we have Ethan Frome by Edith Wharton. It's not very long. I don't want to give anything away about this. I like this book. I think it has one of the most absurd endings to anything taking itself seriously that I've ever read. And I cannot say what that thing is without giving anything away. I'm just going to say toboggan. And if you have any interest in a peculiar ending to a book involving a toboggan, pick this up. It is not a bad book by any means. I am really curious to know what other people think about the ending of Ethan Frome. Next up, we have King Solomon's Ring, Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Z. Lorenz. He likes that Z in there. This is a collection of essays. They just call him an animal observer, so I'm gonna leave it at that. These are essays written in the first-person perspective from Lorenz himself. He lived with hundreds of creatures in his house, basically made a life out of observation, pure observation. These essays are really funny, they're really interesting, they're really insightful. They're not the most scientific things you will ever read, and that's an interesting point of contention inside and outside of this book, but I really enjoyed this. If you're looking to learn a bit, and you're looking to have a good time, anything about creatures, he talks about magpies and jackdaws a lot in this book. I'm getting into birding myself. This is a really cool book. How is the lighting? It's terrible. Oh, that might help a little. This is, next up, Edward Albee. It is The American Dream and Zoo Story. I'd read the Zoo Story, not The American Dream. I know him best from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I love that play. I love the film adaptation. He's got such a handle on the chaos of his narratives. He pits characters mentally against each other in some of the most stressful and anxiety-inducing ways I think I've ever read. Oh, my back. Next up is a duology from Robert Graves. This is I, Claudius and Claudius the God. Now this is a two-parter, and I'll say it once again, these are some of the best books I've ever read. Okay, so these are told from the perspective of the Emperor Claudius Nero Drusus Germanicus. No, I'm getting that wrong. Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus something? Oh man, I thought I could do it. Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus. There we go. This is historical fiction told from the perspective of Claudius before he's emperor, after he becomes emperor of ancient Rome. It's about 1,000 pages all told. I'm pretty sure in an interview one time Robert Graves said he just wrote these because he needed money. He didn't even really care, but they're so good. I fell in love with the narrative style. I fell in love with the way he plays with the idea of history. He really talks through these characters about what history actually means. Claudius himself was a historian, actually a historian. He was a polyglot. He learned so many languages. He did so much in his life. He never wanted to be the emperor of Rome, but he was, and he was not too shabby either. There's so much to learn from these, and I think the best part is I'm not a huge expert on ancient Rome. I'm learning and reading more recently after getting into these, but I think my favorite thing about these is twofold. One, I don't know where the history ends and the fiction begins, because not everything in these books is historically accurate, and that's intentional. There's a narrative going on here, and a really, really interesting and engaging one. For 1,000 pages, it's so engaging. I never lost focus. And the way he plays with history in conjunction with that fact and fiction sort of thing I was just talking about, he really spells out that, like, Claudius being a historian and, like, living history, he really ponders that, and, like, the character of Claudius through the narrative questions that, like, what does history mean? What does it mean to live history? What does it mean to be a historian recording history and living that history yourself? Making history, being a part of history, studying history, like, how do these things play with each other and intersect? And when does history end and fact begin and fiction? And, like, it's so cool. It's just so cool, and this has been a huge inspiration for me on a writing project that I'm working on. These questions are things that I'm asking myself in my own work, and I can't recommend these enough. If you have any interest in Roman life or any kind of, like, historical fiction, these are amazing. Absolutely amazing books. Next up, we have Richard Brautigan once again. This is a Confederate general from Big Sur. Most of his narratives and poems and poetry collections are pretty short. I really like this one. It's absurd, it's silly, it never takes itself too seriously, and I really like, in pretty much any Brautigan I've read so far, things end relatively abruptly. Like, his stories don't wrap in the typical ways you might expect them to. They just kind of conclude in a place that you could see as the middle of any story. It's so open, it's so flowing in and on itself that I don't ever mind the way things end abruptly. I realized I didn't even really talk much about this book itself, and I'm just kind of talking about Richard Brautigan as a writer. There's some fun stuff with alligators in the kitchen. I'm gonna leave it at that. Next up is well, there you have it. It's Damien. What do you know? I read Damien twice this year. I read it earlier in the year, and then I was gonna read The Glass Bead Game. I got a copy of that one, and I wanted to read it, but I realized, like Toni Morrison and The Bluest Eye, before I read Beloved, I needed to reread that. I kind of just needed to reread some Herman Hesse that I'd already read before moving on, so I've read Siddhartha more times than I can count. I read Damien twice last year. I read Steppenwolf about 2 years ago, and I think I want to reread that again soon. There's so much going on under the hood of every one of his novels. There's a lot to learn, and there's a lot to think about, and he's worth the reread. Next up was Shakespeare's As You Like It. I've been wanting to read more of his and taking them a little more as study instead of just reading the narratives, and, trying to pick up copies with more explication and notation so I can understand them a little bit better. I really like these Oxford World's Classics editions. They've got, like, solid, like, 100-page forwards and introductions with a lot of really cool info about Shakespeare and stage production and the play itself that you are reading. This is another comedy. I had a lot of fun with this. It's a magical romp through the forest with many, many romantic pairings. Some of them make a little more sense than others, but I had a lot of fun with this one. Next up, we had The Theban Plays by Sophocles. So most people have at least read Oedipus the King or Oedipus Rex at some point in their school studies, I would imagine. I had myself. I had never read Oedipus at Colonus or Colonus, I don't know how you pronounce it, and I'd never read Antigone either. More to come on Sophocles later on in this list. This wasn't the most fabulous translation, and this wasn't the most fabulous collection, I should say. I'm gonna leave it at that because I'm gonna talk more about Sophocles a little later on. Next we have, drumroll please, another Barbara Kingsolver. This one is Homeland and Other Stories. These are some short stories from very early in her career. I believe this is the second book she put out, I want to say, right after The Bean Trees. I think this is the first Kingsolver I didn't totally connect with. I always connect with her writing in some way. There are a couple really, really good stories in here, but it wasn't the strongest collection to me. Wasn't the strongest collection to me. It'll definitely warrant a reread, maybe in a year or two, when I feel like picking it up again. I didn't connect with a lot of these, and I don't think they're the strongest accounts of her writing in many cases, but there are some good stories in here, so I don't want to judge it too harshly because I probably just missed something there. Next up, we have Tracks by Louise Erdrich, and I'm also going to pull up next one is Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich. Love Medicine, I read this, I want to say 2 years ago. This is one of my favorite books I've ever read. It's her first book. She wrote this, I want to say when she was like 28 or 29, she published it. She wanted to write and publish a book before she was 30, and she did, and it's one of the best books I've ever read. It is told from the perspective, you really want to hit these books over. It's told from the perspective of many members of several different families in indigenous communities in North Dakota. You can see how much I love this book, right? Like all these tabs on here. The way she works through generations of characters and how they relate to each other and how you learn more about them from each other. It's so beautiful. Like, this is the kind of book I'm just gonna read it every year for the rest of my life. It's fantastic. I wanted to pick up more from her, so this one is called Tracks. These are about similar characters. She calls this a round. There are 8 or 9 books in this round, all dealing with similar characters from similar families, and they interrelate to each other in different ways over spans of generations. This book it's just as good as this one, honestly, and these are the kind of books I want to just read and read and read over and over and over again. She's really the star of the show here, you know? We don't need to talk about the book. She's all we really need on screen. Suffice it to say, I am in love with Louise Erdrich. I'm trying to stick to her earlier stuff because I'm very interested in this round of 8 or 9 books, and I'd love to branch out into some of her newer things as well eventually, but for now I'm lost in the sauce of these ones. These are fantastic. And then of course we have Mary Shelley, we have Frankenstein. I've read this book too many times. It'd been a couple years since I picked it up. It's one of my favorite books yet again. I think this was October. I kind of just like indulged in October. I picked up like all of my favorite books and read them like in a row. You know Frankenstein, I know Frankenstein. How much do we really need to say? It's a deceptively incredible story. Every time I read it, I'm reminded of how good it is, because I think when I'm not reading it, it sort of slips to the back of my mind as a book that's like, oh yeah, like, I love that book, but like, you know, it's, what makes this book special? I think a lot of the historical context makes it really special, but I think for what it is and when it was written, structurally, it's a masterpiece, and the things it's saying, I don't want to even get into this too much right now. Everybody knows Frankenstein. It's fantastic. Next up, we have, oh yeah, it's The Master and Margarita, Mikhail Bulgakov. Like I said, I was on a statewide tear of reading some of my favorite books back to back. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I read as a kid. I read a lot. I read every summer and completed all the library reading challenges. This is the book that made me realize why I loved reading. I read this in high school. I read this when I was 15. I didn't know what I was getting into. It was my first foray into the Russians. I want that to be known. This is the first foray I had into Russians. This book is insane. And for this to be the first one is, I didn't know. You know, I had no idea. I was a teenager. I picked it up at the library and just wanted to give it a try because I thought the Penguin Porfirin Volokhonsky cover had a really cool painting on it. And I've since then tried a couple different translations because I want to see how they compare to each other. I know this one doesn't have, it's missing a couple chapters, which is unfortunate, but I wanted to try this one out this year anyway. This book is so beautiful. It's not surprising to me that this is what made me realize why I love reading. Like I said, I read a lot as a kid, but this is the book that made me realize what makes books so special, what you can do with a book. And if you somehow haven't heard of this book, the devil comes to Moscow in Soviet Russia and he just starts messing with everybody. He just antagonizes the writers and the playwrights and the stage directors. He sends people into cacophonies of nightmare, all while interspersed with bits and pieces of the story of Pontius Pilate when he crucifies Jesus. It sounds like the weirdest combination you've ever heard of. It's the best thing you've ever read, I promise you. Alright, next up, I swear this is the last Barbara Kingsolver on the list. I'm not kidding, it's the last one. This is Small Wonder. This is her second collection of essays. I think it's her 8th book. This is the newest book of hers I've read. She has 5 other novels after this. No, 4 novels and nonfiction. I've not read any of those. This is one of my favorite books, actually, from her. I think it's better and stronger than her first essay collection, High Tide in Tucson, which we talked about earlier. Like I said about High Tide in Tucson, she talks about motherhood. She talks about growing her own food and sustaining her family. She talks about reading. She talks about writing. She talks about television and attention and what it means to live in America in the 2000s. Amazing essay collection, one of my favorites I've ever read. I know chronologically her next book was Animal Vegetable Miracle, which is pretty well known for her. Nonfiction, I'm really looking forward to reading that because I love her nonfiction almost more than I love her fiction. which is kind of wild. Next up, we have Mark Kurlansky's Cod. Now, I had this and I had Salt on the shelf. Kurlansky likes to write histories of commodities. This is about cod. It's about cod. It's about how cod was fished. It's about how cod was eaten for hundreds of years and where cod sits in the world today. You could hear a little bit of my New England accent coming out there, and cod. I didn't love this. I think it spends too much time talking about how cod is fished and how cod is traded, and not enough time talking about cod, the fish itself. He really doesn't talk much about cod as a fish or cod as a living species, right? Like he really talks about it as a commodity so extensively for basically the entire 300 pages of the book that it didn't grip me. It really didn't grip me. I found myself trying to move through the pages quicker. I wasn't too enthralled. Some portions were more interesting than the others. I like how he kind of puts historical recipes in the book. There's some cool stuff going on here. Maybe I'll give Salt a try someday, but I wasn't in love. I'm sorry, Marky boy. Next up, we have Pachinko, and most of you probably heard this one. This is pretty famous and new. I don't read a lot of newly published books. You can probably tell from this stack that I'm reading a lot of stuff that's a lot older. This was, again, a recommendation from the same friend who recommended The Unconsoled and something else in this pile that I've already forgotten. It is about Korean emigres in Japan who are forced to live in Japan during World War II and past World War II. It's an easy read. It kind of breezes by despite being 500 pages. There's a good interview in the back from Min Jin Lee, who wrote the book. I don't pick up a whole lot of new fiction myself unless it's a writer that I'm really into. I don't find a lot of fiction coming out these days grips me. But this is a different one. Next up, we have William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. This is my first Faulkner. It took me many years to get to him. Yeah, I mean, I get it. It's crazy. It's crazy reading him finally. The amount of other books I've read and the amount of other writers who are so obviously inspired by this one guy. It's crazy. Toni Morrison, Cormac McCarthy, who I mentioned earlier, the list goes on. He really pioneered a lot of weird and subversive styles and structures to narratives. The book is hard. I think this was his first book, and it was the first I read of him. Definitely merits 2, 3, 5 rereads because there's so much going on under the hood. It's a difficult read, but it's a rewarding read. There's a note to the appendix in this book, right? And in this note to the appendix, he basically talks about characters in the book and their relationships to each other. And I find it really funny because this appendix was not present in the original publication of this book, but Faulkner himself has said, he said this in the note to the appendix, "When you reprint The Sound and the Fury, I have a new section to go with it. When you read it, you will see how it is the key to the whole book." Okay, so this book was published in 1929, and in the 1946 re-edition, he included the key to the entire book. So for 17 years, the key wasn't there. I find that so funny that he didn't even put it in there. And you can trust your reader. I think one of the best things about Faulkner is that he does not care if you don't get it. He says, "I'm going to trust you to spend time with me and understand what I'm saying. And if you don't spend the time with me, then that's your own problem." And there aren't many other writers I can say that about to such the extent as Faulkner, because he's so rewarding when you give him the time. If you don't spend the time on him, you probably won't enjoy yourself. If you give him the time, you will have the time of your life, I promise you. It's about members of the Compson family. Their really strange relationship to each other, and I'm gonna kind of leave it there because you can't really explain this book. You just can't. Alrighty, almost there. Next up on our list, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Reveries of the Solitary Walker. Philosopher, French philosopher, 18th century. He was pissed. He was pissed when he wrote this. He was pissed that no one liked what he was writing, and he wrote this. He took a bunch of walks. He wrote about those walks in relation to his experience, both externally and internally, and he kind of just writes a big screw you to everybody who doesn't like him. I like it for that reason. He's so self-assured. He's so pompous. Half the things he's saying kind of make no sense, but I really enjoy it. Not because it's such an enlightening read in terms of philosophy. I like the way he uses walking and journeying as a vehicle to talk about other things that he's interested in. And I think my favorite thing about it is just how disillusioned this guy is. He's crazy. He's crazy. He wants everybody to believe what he wants to say, and if people don't like it, he just takes it so personally. And he writes this. So I think I enjoyed it from a comedy perspective more than anything. I will give it its chops. Next we have The Island Within by Richard Nelson. I loved this book. It is basically just about this guy, Richard Nelson, autobiographically writing about his relationship with an island in Alaska. He lives there with his family on the coast, and he takes frequent trips to this island that he's just kind of fallen in love with. I fell in love with his writing, in case you couldn't tell by all of those. It's really introspective. It speaks to relationship between person and place, how these things affect our brains and our relationships with other people, what it means to be alone, what it means to be alone in a place that you love so much and feel so much draw towards it. He's so drawn towards the island. And plus, I think the thing that sold me, not even knowing, I picked this up before I had read Jim Harrison, but it's Jim Harrison endorsed, so you knew I was gonna like it. Next up was a slim volume, Paolo Soleri's Arcosanti. He was an Italian architect who had this idea of arcology, architecture, and ecology. He thought about cities, and Arcosanti is a real place. It's about an hour and 15 minutes north of Phoenix, Arizona. I've wanted to go there myself, but I never have. And he basically just designed this city to be sustainable, ecologically viable, and community-oriented. It's a cool idea, and this book is just kind of going through a lot of his different plans for what that sort of city would look like. I got this probably free in my school's library when they were getting rid of it several years ago, so it's a really neat book. I'd like to read more of him in a more concretized form. Next up was N. Scott Momady's House Made of Dawn. This was beautiful. He is an indigenous writer in North America. He's writing about kind of the interplay of being someone who is of indigenous blood but living in a modern world. He really, really nails that, and that's who he is. He was born in Oklahoma. I do apologize, I don't know what nation or tribe he was actually from. It escapes me right now. Yeah, he grew up kind of westernized, but understands his own culture and his own ties and his own heritage in a really unique way. That makes a really unique novel. Next up was Jorge Luis Borges' Labyrinths. Again, a life-changing book. The only thing I'd ever read from him was The Olive, and not the collection, just the story, The Olive. I read that, it's gotta be over a decade ago at this point. I picked this up a couple months ago. This is immaculate. This is inspirational. This is life-changing. This is so good. Oh my gosh. I think this little excerpt from the preface says it best. Although his work has been restricted to the short story, the essay, and poetry, Jorge Luis Borges of Argentina is recognized all over the world as one of the most original and significant figures in modern literature. Fragments, pieces of a puzzle, like, it feels like every one of his stories, essays, and poems is a piece to a larger puzzle that is the inner workings of Borges' mind. There's like 60 different things in this one collection. Some really big favorites on here. Toulon Ukbar Orbis Tertius, Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, The Circular Ruins, The Library of Babel, Funes the Memorious, Death and the Compass is really, really good. The Sect of the Phoenix, the list goes on and on and on. House of Asterion, it goes on and on and on. And as an added bonus, we got Pierogi Heaven. Who doesn't love Pierogi Heaven? Come on! Next up, we had The Song of Igor's Campaign. As it says on the cover, a 12th century epic, or an epic of the 12th century. I can't read it backwards, and also through the book. This was translated by Nabokov. I saw his name on the cover, I was interested. A piece of myth, a piece of epic poetry, a really, really interesting piece of history. Nabokov is the perfect person to translate this. He really, really captures a lot of the little intricacies. It was written in Old Russian in the year, well, okay, it takes place in 1185. I don't think it's entirely clear when it was written, but it wasn't discovered in manuscript form until 1790. And Nabokov does a really great job of kind of tracing the literary and epic history of this poem. It's a really interesting read, and the poem itself it's dense, it's nebulous, it's a bit hard to understand even with Nabokov's notation and footnoting. It traces an interesting story, and the way that Nabokov pulls it apart and talks about how this story sits in history, how the layers of history relate to the finding of this manuscript and the translations that consisted thereupon. It's a cool story of history, if nothing else. Nabokov is always eloquent, and his foreword is really, really well written. And I also find this really neat in relation to Pale Fire, knowing that he did so much translation work in his life, and I guess just thinking about the relation between his works of translation, because I know he also translated like Pushkin and a couple other things, and just seeing his works of translation and thinking about them in relation to Pale Fire and how that book is structured is just an interesting thought experiment to me. So this was cool. I don't think this is a very common find, but I saw it on the shelf in a used store and I thought, what the heck. Next up is another Richard Brautigan. This is The Abortion, an Historical Romance, 1966. Ooh, yikes. This one it's weird. There's things I love about this book. It is about a guy who works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year in a library. He lives there. He works there, he breathes there, he eats there, he sleeps there. Everything he does is in this library. The purpose of the library is to allow folks to bring books that they have written, unique, one-of-a-kind books, to put them on the shelf and exist there. And nobody ever takes the books out. They just exist there. Richard Brautigan, he's a misogynist. He is. I didn't mention that in the other books I said earlier. He is a really, really big misogynist. I don't like the way he writes about women. This is the worst and most prime example of his misogyny. This book has a lot of really cool ideas in it, and I wish he wasn't so misogynistic. I'm not going to get into all of the problems I have with this. I think the ideas are engaging, but I don't. Up next, we have As I Lay Dying, once again, William Faulkner. I love this book. I think I connected to this one a lot more than The Sound and the Fury. It's funny because this is also a challenging read. I'm learning anything from Faulkner will be. But now that I've read The Sound and the Fury, I don't think any Faulkner could be really difficult after that. So rewarding when you give it the time, when you give it the attention. Basically, Addie Bundren, the mother of a family of, I want to say 5, dies, and her family goes on a really strange adventure through Mississippi to bring her to her burial place. Ooh, 5 books left. 5 books. We're almost there. Next up, we've got 2 Robert Louis Stevensons. We've got Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and what do you call them? Treasure Island. I read Jekyll and Hyde many years ago. Been a long time. It's such an enthralling story, and it's such a classic. And Treasure Island, it's pretty wild because I'd never read this, but everybody knows the story in some way. There's so many things come from this story, like even just structurally. Like if you've seen Disney's Treasure Planet, that movie's great. Super heavily based off this book and this whole story, and the characters' names are the same. But even just, Yo Ho Ho and a Bottle of Rum, or like so many things are from this book. Really had fun with both of these. Classic kind of horror story and really excellent adventure. I think it holds up even all these years later. Like, such a fun story, and I'm a pirate lover, so like really had fun with that one too. Then we have The Jungle Book, Rudyard Kipling. It's good. It's wild because Kipling is not a good person. He is an insane racist. The dude wrote, I think it's an essay called The White Man's Burden, so I'm gonna leave that there. Despite the guy being such a racist, this is wonderful. There's a lot of really good stories in here about Mowgli. I'd like to read the follow-up. I'm not so keen on Kipling in general, but I did have a good time with this. Next up, we have some more Sophocles. This is Antigone and Other Tragedies. So this was Antigone, Electra, and Women of Trachis. So the way Oliver Taplin, the editor and translator here, organized these was he put what he called Sophocles' 3 female tragedies into this collection, and he put his other 4 tragedies called his male tragedies into a second collection. This is actually the second collection, but he sort of split them that way. I like, and he talks about it in his introduction or forward, how the Theban plays in a collection, which we talked a little bit about earlier, it's arbitrary because the order of the plays is not the order that Sophocles wrote those tragedies in. Even though they go chronologically like that, he didn't write them in that order. He wrote them at different points, decades apart in his lifetime. And to group them as the Theban plays, or the Theban trilogy, it's not arbitrary because there is a link between these stories, but it's arbitrary in the sense that they weren't meant to be read or experienced together. So the way he organizes them of 3 female plays or tragedies and 3 male tragedies, I kind of like that because it's no more or less relevant or impactful than the idea of grouping the Theban tragedies. I just grabbed the other collection so that I could read his translation of the other 4 plays. Antigone is amazing. I'd read it earlier this year. Women of Trachis, really enjoyed the Heracles story, and Electra is excellent too. I would love to talk about these maybe some other time, but really enjoyed this collection. His translation doesn't seem like it's perfect, and there are an unfortunate amount of misprints and typos in this volume, but it is really good. And last but not least, the last thing I read in 2024 was Muriel Rukeyser's The Book of the Dead. This was also a reread. I've read this a couple times. This is a historical collection of poems. Muriel Rukeyser went to, I'm so bad, is it North Carolina? Virginia. Second time that a book takes place in Virginia, and I say North Carolina. She traveled to Gauley Bridge, West Virginia, the Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster of 1931. Basically hundreds of people, not even entirely documented, died in this horrible mining disaster. She went there, she wrote poetry about it. There's a really good foreword in this book from Catherine Venable Moore, where she kind of takes her own journey through these places and understands them from Muriel Rukeyser's perspective. Some of the poems are better than others. The final titular poem, The Book of the Dead, is astonishing. It's beautiful. I learned about it from a professor many years ago, and I've read it a couple times since then. It's a really nice reread. It's like a one-sitting book. You could read this in a couple hours, and I'm slow, so that's coming from me. That is it. That is 106 books. That's the most I've ever read in a year. I think I pretty much doubled my reading from 2023. I read like 50 or 60 books then. It was a really cool journey. I love reading. I don't need incentive or reason or excuses to read. I just love reading, and I just thought it would be fun to push myself to read 100 books in a year. So I did do that, and I'm proud of myself. I knew I could do it, but I'm proud of myself nonetheless. Read some really cool stuff this year, read some not so great stuff, and you know, that's just how it goes. I'm looking forward to another year of reading. I've already been on my merry way, so reading at the end of the day should be for pleasure. It should be because you enjoy it, and you should read things that you enjoy. I try to remember that. I don't like to pick things up that I'm not interested in, you know? I'm grateful. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for libraries. I'm grateful for bookstores. I'm grateful for eyes and ears and hands and being able to pick up these beautiful things we call books. If you watched this entire thing, thank you. I don't even know how long this is. It's probably very long. If you sat through the whole thing, I hope you used 2x speed, because that's the way to go when you watch stuff on YouTube or listen to me in the background. Thank you, seriously. Thank you for being here. I've never done this before. It was a fun experience. If you enjoyed this, please let me know in the comments, because I don't know if I'll ever do this again. But if people liked it, then maybe I will. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm really sorry about the lighting at the start of the video. I hope that didn't turn people off, because it's a lot better now. I'm gonna go make some food, because I've been sitting here for like 4 hours. And I'm gonna go put all these books back on the shelf, because my shelves look absolutely ransacked. So thank you for coming. The camera's about to die. We gotta sign off. Bye.